The British justice system is the envy of the world. But in the past, mistakes have been made.
Between the year 1900 and the year 1964, approximately 800 people were hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these long-standing convictions could be a miscarriage of justice.
She's been assaulted with a weapon, and there's been more than one blow.
In this series, a living relative will attempt to clear their family name.
Because behind us here was where they found her.
Searching for new evidence.
The clear big picture here is one of drowning.
With help from two of the UK's leading barristers, one for the defence.
There is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
And one for the prosecution.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
They're on a mission to solve a mystery, submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Thank you both for your submissions. I shall consider these matters for myself.
Can this modern investigation rewrite history? On a warm July night in 1927, a young couple were walking on a canal towpath in central Birmingham. They were accosted by a man who told them they were trespassing and demanded payment. 22-year-old Charles Broomhead offered the attacker 4 pennies, but was rebuked. Charles told his 18-year-old girlfriend, Olive Turner, to make a run for it. The attacker punched Charles unconscious. And in view of alarmed witnesses, grappled Olive, carrying the teenager off under a bridge. The next morning, Olive's lifeless body was pulled from the canal. Suspicion soon fell on 32-year-old factory worker James Joseph Power. Despite claiming he was never there, Power was charged and convicted of Olive's murder. On the 31st of January 1928 at Winson Green Prison, he was hanged. Only a few hundred yards from where the assault took place. Now, over 90 years on, James Joseph Power's grandson, Mike Power, and his wife, Sue, want to learn more about the case that changed their family history so significantly.
Dad sat us down and he said, there's something I need to tell you because you carry your grandfather's name. And he took us through it, that he'd been hung. But that was all he spoke. He didn't say anything else about it.
All over the years, we didn't know anything, did we,
No.
of the details of any of it?
The more I read and the more I heard about it, I just think it's very, very strange.
After all the suspicions and the thoughts over the years, it'd be nice to have some kind of conclusion.
It would be nice to know that he didn't do it.
That's the total of what we actually know of the background of your granddad.
The case against Power was a controversial one, with no physical evidence linking him to the crime. But was it a miscarriage of justice? And can a new legal team cast the conviction in a different light? Jeremy Dean QC is one of the UK's most respected defence barristers. Sasha Was QC has both defended and prosecuted some of the country's highest profile defendants. Mike and Sue have travelled to London to meet Sasha and Jeremy, who will be re-examining Mike's grandfather's case.
Hello there,
Hello.
Susan.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Michael.
Good to meet you, Michael, Susan,
Nice
Jeremy.
to meet you.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Is there anything specific that you could say you find most troubling about the evidence that you've come across?
Mostly circumstantial. That's the most worrying part of it.
And if it would have been in today's day and age,
Yeah.
he probably wouldn't have not been found guilty.
The question of whether your grandfather might have been convicted in the modern era is something that we'll definitely be looking at, because there are cases of a historical nature where people were convicted and in modern times they might not even have been charged.
I think what Jeremy and I can say to you is we don't know where our investigations are going to lead, but what we can guarantee is that we will look at everything and consider every question as to whether there is a doubt in this case. Well, lovely to meet you.
Good to meet you.
And you, thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Sasha and Jeremy need to start their investigation by examining the key facts of that fateful evening in 1927.
On the night of the 2nd July, a young couple, Olive Turner and Charles Broomhead, were walking back from the cinema along the towpath, which we see here. At approximately 11:15 at night, they were accosted by a man being 32-year-old James Joseph Power. Now, witnesses who were in the area of the towpath saw a man fitting the description of Power grabbing Olive around the waist and taking her off under a bridge. The next morning, Olive Turner's body was recovered from the canal a short distance away from where she'd last stopped. Suspicion fell on Power, who was quickly arrested. He vigorously protested his innocence, saying that he wasn't there at the time of Olive's killing.
But we really have to be sure that whoever was with her was guilty of homicide rather than this being an accident. The second feature which I think we need to look at is identification, because identification really was at the heart of this case. And I would like to look at the nature of the identification, the quality of the identification, and how reliable it was, and whether it was supported in any way. So there are a number of things that this case throws up, and I think they need careful analysis.
Olive Turner was an 18-year-old orphan who lived with her grandmother near the canal. She had known her boyfriend Charles Broomhead for 9 months, but had only been courting him for 6 weeks. Mike Power and his wife Sue want to understand the sequence of events put forward by the prosecution at trial. They've come to the very stretch of canal where the murder took place almost a century ago.
I saw two couples standing against the asylum wall. As we walked, we had passed them and reached a point about 20 yards from the arm of the canal, which goes towards Lodge Road.
It was here, in a place known as The Cut, that Olive Turner and Charles Broomhead were ambushed.
He said, "You're trespassing up here." He was a tall man and spoke with some authority. He had a dirty white collar with a tie dark and twisted. He was wearing a dark grey suit with a cap which was rather old.
After ushering Charles and Olive away towards the main canal, he demanded a bribe.
When they've offered money and he said it's not enough, he's told his girlfriend to run, and she's ran towards Clissold Street, which is that way.
All three ran in the same direction and were spotted by multiple witnesses. But as Charles caught up with the attacker, he was punched.
My grandfather's then supposed to have hit him, knocked him to the ground, and then chased after Olive.
Other couples saw the man taking Olive off in the direction of the bridge. Screams were heard. The time was registered at 11:40 p.m. After regaining consciousness, Charles Broomhead scoured the waterway for his girlfriend, but she was nowhere to be found. At 5 a.m. the following morning, police recovered Olive's dead body from the water. Her wristwatch was stopped at 11:41 p.m. There may be dispute over the circumstances around Olive Turner's death, but what is in no doubt is that drowning played a key role. Sasha and Jeremy are meeting with forensic pathologist Dr. Basil Perdue to see if he can shed any light on the conclusions of Olive's post-mortem.
Sasha.
Happy to see you.
Happy to see you.
Basil, good to see you.
Hi there.
I think the first thing we want to know is it possible to determine whether this was accidental death or homicide?
Frankly, no.
And why is that?
Because there is really nothing to distinguish the condition of the body as described in the evidence given by the expert witnesses from any other body fished out of a canal.
Were there any marks on her head or body indicative that she may have been pushed into the water by another person, whether deliberately or accidentally?
This is the area of indefinite blue discoloration or bluish discoloration on the left frontal region.
Is that a term you're familiar with?
It's not a standard term. He's describing an inability to put a firm diagnostic name to it.
In relation to the finding of indefinite bluish discoloration, is it your understanding that that was classified as being symptomatic of the infliction of trauma in the course of the trial?
It gradually emerges. It's as though things begin in a highly indefinite way and they become a bit more definite as the trial goes on.
In the direction of her having been struck a blow?
Yes. He's used this very vague phrase, indefinite bluish discoloration. He's virtually saying, I don't quite know what it was.
Really, it doesn't help us one way or another?
No, but there is an extraordinary prologue to that in which he's answering, she must have screamed before she entered the water, and on examining the head reflecting the scalp, etc. Now, this is a pathologist or someone who's done an autopsy. She must have screamed before she entered the water.
What's your view of the appropriateness of the response?
Nil.
Can you conceive of why he might have genuinely believed, if he did, that she must have screamed having entered the water?
All a pathologist can tell you is that she shows clear signs of drowning, and she has a couple of findings, one of which is a bluish discoloration of the left side of the front of the head, whose meaning is completely obscure.
We cannot say from the pathology whether this was homicide, accident. Simply not possible.
That's right. The clear big picture here is one of drowning.
And thank you very much.
Extremely helpful.
Okay.
It's clear Olive met with a traumatic death, but was it murder? And was James Joseph Power responsible? Power served in World War I in the Irish Guards, attaining the rank of Lance Corporal. After the war, he moved to Birmingham, where he became a police officer. He had a volatile and short-lived career, clashing with many officers, including a detective sergeant called Albert Edwards. Power was sacked after only 3 years for misconduct. Unbelievably, on the night of Olive's abduction and killing, he had been on the canal towpath, impersonating a police officer. And the man who was to lead the investigation against Power was none other than his old force foe, Detective Sergeant Albert Edwards. Mike and Sue have come to meet case expert and author John Eddleston, who has an insight into Detective Sergeant Edwards.
First, it looks like an open and shut case. You've got a woman who tragically died in the canal. You've got evidence from witnesses that a man masquerading as a policeman, who was identified as James Joseph Power, is responsible for the death. That's it. He's hanged. He's paid the penalty. But the more you look into it, there are certain points which lead you to be a little bit suspicious and to say that this may well be an unsafe conviction.
Can I get you to go through those reasons why?
Certainly. It begins with the arrest. Now, you know the basic story, that this event takes place and a police officer, a Detective Sergeant Albert Edwards, decides that the description, the circumstances fit an ex-constable, an ex-policeman. The witnesses who did see something on the canal that night, they all describe a man in a dark grey suit.
That description probably fitted 3/4 of the men in Birmingham at the time.
But it could well be, we don't know the full details of that, it could well be that that's the start of animosity between these two. Edwards was determined perhaps to be involved in his dismissal, or Power blamed him for his dismissal, and that's the reason why these two people now are the worst of enemies. I mean, it's very curious that you've got such a vague description, as you said, that would fit half the men
That's
in
right,
Birmingham.
yeah.
And immediately, Edwards is saying, that's Power. All through this case, Detective Sergeant Edwards' fingerprints can be found.
Many witnesses at trial went on record to say that they saw a man impersonating a police officer, matching the description of James Joseph Power. But in the dark of a canal arm and late on a Saturday night, how certain could they really have been? Sasha and Jeremy are plotting out the movements of the key witnesses.
So, Jeremy, this is the Birmingham Canal. It would have been very busy on a Saturday night because it was very popular with courting couples. So the first witness I want to look at is John Godfrey. He was a boatman who was actually walking down the canal path. He believed that the person he saw was a police officer and, in fact, took steps to warn other couples who were on the canal that there was a police officer about.
It's easy for a witness such as John Godfrey to say, I had a very good look. The question, bearing in mind the circumstances, is did he?
So the next significant witness is Charles Broomhead. Now, Charles Broomhead was with Olive Turner. The two of them were walking down this area, which is known as the Cut, and it was here where they encountered the man that the prosecution said was Power.
The description given by Charles Broomhead is by no means foolproof.
Charles Broomhead said he saw the face of the man whom the prosecution said was Power.
But equally, we know that Charles Broomhead was disorientated by having been struck. So what value is to be placed on Mr. Broomhead's assertion that he saw the face is questionable.
So the next two witnesses are another courting couple, and around this area, they hear Broomhead say to Olive, run. At that stage, Olive runs in that direction, reaches this area, and Power catches up with her, and he is seen to take her to an area under a bridge. Witnesses in this area, who of course don't see any of this, but they describe hearing piercing screaming. And then finally, at 11:45, a witness sees a man climbing over a wall. The prosecution case is that that man was James Joseph Power.
Whilst there are a number of witnesses involved here, the big question is, do they, taken together, really give quality evidence against Mr. Power?
Mike wants to delve further into his grandfather's brief career in the police force to understand the conditions around his dismissal. He's come with Sue to meet Corinne Brazier at the West Midlands Police Museum. Corinne has sourced Power's records, and astonishingly, it suggests he's got form.
He originally received a misconduct record for neglect of duty in January 1922. And then again in January 1923, he is charged with discreditable conduct by acting in a manner likely to bring discredit upon the reputation of this force, where he is supposed to have abducted a young lady, a servant, 15 years old, in the employ of Mr. Fred Taylor, taken her against her will down Hagley Road and through a gate to an allotment. And there is a subsequent offence whereby Mr. Frederick Taylor ironically reports the offence to James Power, and he fails in his duty to report that offence. And for both of those offences, he was dismissed in January 1923.
So how easy in those days would it be for a member of the public to say that, to convince another member of the public that he was a serving police officer?
We obviously did have the CID. We had plainclothes officers who might have been seen out and about, might have been involved in undercover activity. So I think if you had an air of authority about you and you were believable in how you approach someone, it was probably relatively easy to convince trusting members of the public that you were a member of the force.
To assault a 15-year-old girl, it's not nice, it's not good. It just adds a little bit more to his bad character, I think.
Could Power's abuse of his position as a police officer have fueled the resentment it's alleged his ex-colleague, D.S. Edwards, had towards him? Jeremy has been examining the police investigation records. He's found evidence that Detective Sergeant Edwards took unusual steps in kickstarting the manhunt for Olive's killer.
On the 5th of July, just after 4:15, following the coroner's court hearing, Brimhead was approached by Detective Sergeant Albert Edwards, who initially took him to a particular factory and then took him on to Power's workplace so as to watch men leaving work, one of whom was Power, in effect facilitating the identification of Power.
What I think we ought to look at in the case of Power is this. We know that his character was very much a problem for him. In February of 1927, he represented himself as a police officer, impersonated a police officer, in effect, because he had been dismissed at that stage. 3 months later, on the 12th of May 1927, he attempted to kiss a young lady called Ruby Gummer. She struggled, and in order to retaliate against her struggle, he beat her in the face, knocking out her teeth. Finally, in the time leading up to this murder, on the 23rd of May, he again pretended to be a police officer and he raped a young woman, Lucy Folkes. The point is obvious, is it not, that all of those features are found and come together on the 2nd of July when he's impersonating himself as a police officer and he is preying on a young woman who eventually drowns.
Could it be that because Edwards believed that Power was the type of character you yourself have just portrayed, that that gave Edwards the motive to want to fit Power up?
Mr. Power had a history of misconduct involving impersonating a police officer after he himself had been dismissed from the police force. He had a history of sexually assaulting women, and he had a history of extorting money whilst impersonating a police officer. On the 2nd of July, all of those three elements came together. Now, the chances of somebody else conducting themselves or misconducting themselves in those three particular ways on that date is extremely unlikely.
Despite Power's form for sexual assault, there was no evidence from the post-mortem that Olive Turner had been raped. However, he was tried for her murder, and on the 9th of December 1927, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Power was sentenced to death almost exclusively on eyewitness identification. The case hinged on a police ID parade. To gain an insight into the protocols around Power's lineup, Sasha and Jeremy are meeting forensic psychologist Dr. Josh Davis, an expert in the field.
Hello.
So I think what we'd like to know to start with is what the shape, what the framework of an identification parade would have been in 1927.
Well, it would have consisted of people all standing in a row like this. They would have probably grabbed either people off the street who met the appearance of the suspect, or perhaps just found some police officers off duty to come and stand in the lineup. The witness would have walked down the line and to tap someone on the shoulder. As you could imagine, that would have been very, very scary for a witness to actually touch a murderer on the shoulder.
Unusually, at the police lineup, the very man who it's alleged took an unfair interest in Power right from the start, Detective Sergeant Edwards, was in attendance.
We all know that historically there have been many instances of police malpractice. I mean, the presence of the investigating officer could lead to witnesses being prompted deliberately.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
I mean, there are historical cases, definitely, where the police did prompt a witness to select someone from a lineup, and therefore their presence there is always going to be risky.
Have you seen any evidence that these parades were conducted unfairly?
No.
Have you seen any evidence that the officer Edwards, who was the investigating officer, was corrupt in any way?
Not from any of the written evidence that I have seen.
Thank you.
The only witness to have unequivocally identified Power was John Godfrey.
That is correct.
6 do not make an unequivocal identification.
A large number of other people failed to identify him at all from the identity parade.
I take it that you haven't seen any record of the position of Power on the identification parade. In other words, how far down the line he was.
No, I have no idea.
But the words used by John Godfrey were, "I haven't got to go far, that is the man." So the inference to be drawn from that, quite conceivably, is that Godfrey did not examine the whole of the parade before identifying Power.
This is possible, yes.
And if that's right, if it's correct that Godfrey identified Power without scrutinising each and every member of the parade, in the modern era, that would render Godfrey's identification potentially inadmissible evidence. Do you agree?
That is correct. A witness today would be expected to watch all of the videos through twice, unless they were so upset that they did not want to watch anymore.
There's no reason to believe that of Godfrey, is there?
No, not at all.
And the additional concern is that Godfrey, who appears to have identified Power very early on, might well, based on the words he used, "I haven't got to go far, that is the man," there is a possibility arising from his use of language that someone had told him who the suspect was.
It is, again, entirely possible that that could have happened.
And especially where you have an investigating officer lurking in the background, when, on any view, that's not best practice, that is an additional reason for concern.
I agree completely.
Mike's journey into his grandfather's past is revealing aspects of his family history he only partially knew before. Mike and Sue have come to the house where James Joseph Power lived, and where his widow, Mike's grandmother, remained until she died.
It's very strange coming back because it's not how I remember it. It doesn't look anything like I remember it. I remember seeing a photograph on a unit. Never took much notice of it, but I did once ask, "Who's that man?" And I was curtly told, "It's nobody you know." And that was it. And then the next time I came, which was probably a month or so later, the photograph had gone, and I never saw it again. And I just naturally assumed that probably that was my granddad.
There is no doubt James Joseph Power had a history of violence. But was he capable of murdering Olive Turner? With the investigation almost at its end, Jeremy has found something troubling regarding the conclusion of Power's trial.
Sasha, the biggest issue for me, arising from the summing up, is one which relates to a potential misdirection by the judge on murder and manslaughter. What the judge does when directing the jury on murder and manslaughter is to reverse the burden of proof, to put it on the defendant, which is a fundamentally wrong direction. What he said to the jury was that every case of homicide is a case of murder until the person who has caused the homicide satisfies the jury of his countrymen that it was something less than murder. And he goes on to say, quote, "Because it is for the defendant to show that it is only manslaughter, the law presumes that homicide is murder," end of quote. This is a material misdirection and one which puts the burden of proof on the defendant. And if that's right, as I see it, Power's conviction for murder must be quashed.
Jeremy, I agree with you that having read that part of the summing up, it appears that the judge put the burden of proving manslaughter rather than murder on the defence, which is completely contrary to the principles of justice in this country. However, if that was a misdirection, and we're both right about that, safe. And on the facts of this case, whoever it was who chased Olive Turner down the canal, and whether she fell in fear, jumped in to get away from him, or whether he pushed her in, those were all unlawful and felonious acts, which, according to the law at the time, would have amounted to murder. So the point I'm making is that although that direction certainly jarred with me in the same way that it jarred with you, the result may not be very important.
I am confident that as a consequence of the judge's summing up and other considerations available to me, that there are strong arguments to put before Judge Radford to the effect that James Joseph Powell's conviction is unsafe.
On the 31st of January 1928, James Joseph Power was hanged at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. His body is understood to be buried on site in unconsecrated ground. Mike and Sue have come to the prison boundary to pay their respects.
At the start of this journey, I really believed that my granddad was not a nice man, was quite a nasty man.
But we do see this man differently now, much differently, and more as a human being than just somebody that was in Mike's past that he didn't know. Well, this is a paper of the actual execution from the Birmingham Mail. There were so many people outside, which is a bit sad to read.
It's hard to believe how my nan must have been feeling, standing outside that prison gate with all those people, waiting for somebody to come out and pin a notice on the gate of the prison to say that your husband is now dead. It must have been horrendous for her, absolutely horrendous.
There's things there that point to it being an unfair trial.
Right.
What particularly are you thinking of?
The general description at the beginning where it was a tall man in a dark
Yes.
suit and a cap, and the policeman said, "I know who that is."
Right.
Straight away. Well, that description could have fitted three-quarters of the men in Birmingham at that time.
So your concern, really, is that this was an unsafe identification?
I'm hopeful that the judge will be convinced by the arguments put forward.
Sasha and Jeremy must now present their arguments to Judge David Radford. With over 14 years as a senior judge to the largest Crown Court in England and Wales, he's tried some of the country's highest profile murder cases.
Please seat. We are here today for me to consider, with the assistance of learned counsel, the safety of the conviction of James Joseph Power in December 1927 for the murder of Olive Turner. Mr. Dean, if you'd like to make your submissions.
Certainly. There are, in fact, two central aspects of my submission in support of the conviction being unsafe. The first relates to the circumstances in which Mr. Power was identified. It's my submission that the identification parade was fundamentally flawed. Detective Sergeant Edwards, along with other investigating officers, were present at the identification parade. This would not be permitted today. In the course of our inquiry, we've had significant input from Dr. Josh Davis, a forensic psychologist specialising in identification procedures. There was only one positive identification from a man called John Godfrey, who notably is recorded as having said the following, quote, "I haven't got to go far, that is the man," suggests that the one positive identification was made without proper scrutiny of the identification procedure. Secondly, I submit that the trial judge made very significant errors when summing the case up to the jury. What the judge did was to reverse the burden of proof as regards manslaughter. He said that if it was homicide, was it a case of murder, or has the defence shown that it was only a case of manslaughter? Now, pausing there, before I conclude with one further reference, what I say is this. that whatever argument Miss Wass advances to suggest that the possibility of manslaughter was minimal, in my submission, it doesn't matter. The defendant had an absolute right for the jury properly to have manslaughter left, and one will never know, had the judge put the matter correctly to the jury, James Joseph Power might have been convicted of manslaughter and not hanged.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Dean. Yes, Miss Wass.
Your Honour, this is a case which relied heavily on the identification of a person who was impersonating a police officer, extorting money from vulnerable people. A proper identification parade was constituted. As Mr. Dean has reminded you, the witness John Godfrey picked out Mr. Power positively. So positively, he saw the 9 people on the parade and was immediately able to say, I don't need to go any further, that is the man. That is an indication in our submission of somebody who immediately recognises the person that they have previously seen. And there is not a scintilla of evidence that the Detective Sergeant Edwards acted in any way other than entirely properly in this case. Indeed, there is further evidence about what is known of the character of James Joseph Power. The man on the canal seen by Mr. Broomhead was impersonating a police officer, demanding money, and intent on sexually assaulting Olive Turner. In fact, James Joseph Power had been a police officer, but on the 10th of January 1923, he was dismissed from the police force for discreditable conduct after he took a 15-year-old girl to an allotment against her will. May I then turn to the issue of murder and manslaughter? So whilst I accept wholly there could not have been a burden placed on the defendant to prove manslaughter, the burden of proof always remained on the prosecution. But the suggestion that by being deprived of a verdict, which would have been wholly inapplicable to this case, has made the murder conviction unsafe is completely illogical. So if we submit to Your Honour that there is nothing to suggest that this verdict is unsafe.
Mr. Dean, you want to say something?
Yes, could I deal with the question of alleged previous misconduct? That none of the previous matters featured in Mr. Power's trial. And so when Ms. Wass argues that they are capable of supporting the identification evidence in this case, that is a comment which does not bear upon the safety of the conviction based upon the evidence that was put before the jury.
Well, thank you, Mr. Dean. I shall take account of that submission. I wonder if you'd be kind enough now both to leave so I can review the papers in the light of your submissions, and in due course I shall invite you back so you can hear what my judgment is.
Thank you.
The legal arguments have now been presented to the judge. But has Jeremy done enough to question the original conviction?
How do you react to what was said in the hearing?
I've got no doubt that my grandfather was up to no good over a period of months on that canal bank. But I don't see the progression from demanding money with menaces to murder.
Hopefully the judge will reflect your feelings in his decision.
Did James Joseph Power kill Olive Turner on the canal towpath over 90 years ago? Or was he a victim of mistaken identity and police corruption? The judge is now ready to deliver his verdict.
As the trial judge made clear to the jury, there were 2 crucial questions for them to consider. I acknowledge that the procedure adopted at the parades was not as would be expected today under the codes of practice. The presence of investigating officers in 1927, though, was not prohibited, although in 1925 it had become best practice not to allow it. Nothing, it seems, emerged at the trial to undermine the police's integrity at any stage of these procedures. The second issue was, had the prosecution proved, if it was, that this was a case of murder? Mr. Dean is right. That was a clear misdirection. I considered that submission carefully. With respect, I disagree. The defence did not put forward a defence of manslaughter, understandably, as there was no basis in evidence to support it. I have considered the matter for myself, and I am satisfied overall that this was a safe conviction of murder. I shall now rise.
Mike, what do you think of the judge's reasons?
I just feel a little bit deflated now.
I know that's not the decision you wanted.
That's the way I feel at the moment, but probably in the light of day,
Yeah.
probably look at it in a different
Yeah.
aspect and probably think, well, yeah, it was right that we did try.
It was absolutely right. You know, I think you should applaud yourselves for having seen this journey through. And it's certainly been a great pleasure from our point of view to meet you and share this experience. Yeah. But look, thanks so much for all your patience and cooperation. It's been great meeting you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you.
And you too, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Sash.
I am a bit disappointed. Back of my mind, really, I suppose, I thought that was going to be the verdict, but I was hoping that it wouldn't be. I've taken a lot from this journey. I've learned a lot of things about my granddad that I would never have found out other than this journey that we've gone down. And there's parts of it that makes me feel proud of him and that I wished I could have known him, but not to be, but never mind.